In 1801, Norfolk, USA, a domestic servant from the Blackthorn household stumbled into a nearby tannery covered in vomit and incoherent with fever, clutching a child's silk bonnet stiff with dark stains. The bonnet belonged to Ruth Blackthorn, age 6, declared deceased 3 days earlier from seasonal malaise, according to the town registrar. Her parents, Elias and Mercy Blackthorn, were known for their somber attire and fastidious manners, hosting dinners for magistrates and shipping investors in their candle-lit parlor near Market Street. Behind lace curtains and polished walnut doors, the couple maintained a precise, almost sacred regimen for their 6 children, who rarely spoke in public and often appeared pallid and distracted. In late 1790s Norfolk, amid a wheat tariff crisis and outbreaks of yellow fever, urban families began turning inward, shielding their reputations behind medical claims and burial receipts. But ledger entries from the local apothecary show a sudden surge in arsenic purchases by Mercy Blackthorn between 1798 and 1804, followed by 5 child-sized coffins ordered in less than 7 years. Why did no authority ever question the death certificates? The Blackthorn family commanded quiet respect in Norfolk, known for their punctuality at chapel and the faint scent of laudanum on their clothes. But when a 1799 coroner's journal noted conflicting internal decay patterns in 2 Blackthorn siblings, it triggered a grim review of burial records that began to unravel their myth. Vosidis, now continue with Chapter 1, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script the beginning of the escalation, where you will report the first concrete signs that something is wrong, introduce witnesses, neighbors, or official records that mention unusual changes. Describe scenes with sensory depth, e.g. creaking doors, dust in the air, etc. Reinforce the atmosphere of strangeness and apprehension. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words such as unbelievable, attention, etc. Allowed examples: unbelievable, attention, okay. Do not use forbidden characters, tinit. Besios lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 1, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3. Roterista. Ingles longa. Horror. Dis. The earliest known record bearing the Blackthorn name in Norfolk dates back to 1787, when Elias Blackthorn registered a modest shipping account at the Harbour Ledger Office. By the turn of the century, however, Elias had acquired 4 warehouses near the waterline and a stake in a sugar refining operation near Church Hill. With his gains, he purchased a 3-story brick home on Plum Street, where he lived with his wife Mercy and their children. The home was known for its thick curtains, always drawn, and its copper gutters, which never tarnished, no matter the rain or soot. It was there, behind that heavy red door with its lion-shaped brass knocker, that the first signs of rupture were noticed, not by family nor by magistrates, but by a milk carrier named Desmond Halley. In a deposition given years later under oath, Halley recalled the week of May 1798. It was hot for May and the shutters were all closed. The place stank of boiled roots, but it wasn't food. It was sour, almost metallic. Halley described a strange interaction with one of the Blackthorn boys, Ezekiel, aged 10, who appeared at the side gate looking confused, holding an empty tin pail. He asked me if milk could be blue, Halley wrote, and when I laughed he blinked slow like he didn't understand the joke. I told him no, of course not, and he just stood there, didn't speak again. Just turned and walked away with the pail like it weighed more than it did. 2 days later, Ezekiel was buried. Official records show a death attributed to consumptive weakness. No physician signed the certificate. At the time, Norfolk's Board of Health had no standardized process for investigating pediatric fatalities. Midwives often filled in as informants. One such woman, Alma Rowe, testified in 1807 to having been summoned to the Blackthorn House 6T months after Ezekiel's death, ostensibly to assist with the feverish infant Thomas. She described the air inside as unbreathable, thick with vinegar fumes and something sweet, like bruised peaches left in the sun. The child was listless, Rose stated. The mother pressed a cloth to his lips and told me he'd taken plum broth, but his gums were pale and sticky, not fevered, not flushed, just empty. Thomas was declared dead the following morning. The cause listed lung rot. Neighbors began to murmur. There were whispers from the parson's wife, who noted that Mercy Blackthorn had ceased attending communion and would only receive the pastor at dusk. Her letters to her sister in Connecticut, preserved in a family archive, mention that house on Plum, where the windows seemed to weep sap in winter. What emerged next was the curious inventory of the Blackthorn kitchen. In 1800, an apprentice tax collector named Cyril Paddock conducted an unannounced tally of the household goods, part of a citywide reassessment ordered to finance new paving along Bank Street. Paddock's list, filed with the municipal records, includes an unusually detailed account of perishables: 8 bushels of wormwood, 2 crates of rhubarb root, half-barrel soda crystals, 15 vials marked tinct, belladonna, and a sealed chest marked unfit for sale containing 27 sachets of bitter almond paste. Belladonna, bitter almond, both known, though not commonly discussed, for their lethal properties if improperly handled. But at the time, such items were sometimes used for home remedies or pest control. Still, Paddock made note of what he called the odd silence. He wrote in the margin, "No child's voice, no movement above the parlor." The servant would not meet my eyes. That servant, identified as May Cotter, would later testify before a grand jury in 1809. In her testimony, she recounted a specific incident during the winter of 1801. Miss Ruth had been coughing. Not the dry cough from cold, but something wet, like her lungs were soaking inside. I brought her toast soaked in milk and honey, but Madam took it away, said she'd already been given tincture, said I mustn't interfere. Cotter described a scene 3 days later, on the afternoon Ruth died. It was snowing, light but steady. The house was quiet except for the ticking of that enormous brass clock. I went upstairs to check on Miss Ruth, but her room smelled sharp, like boiled nails. Her little shoes were set by the fireplace and she was on the bed not moving. Madam was brushing her hair, just brushing it slow, like she didn't notice I was there. The body was removed before dawn. Cotter never saw the girl again. It was shortly after Ruth's burial that the first formal question arose in writing. Dr. Silas Trenholm, a retired army surgeon, wrote a letter to the Office of Records after attending a dinner at the Blackthorn residence, where he claimed to have been served bitter greens that caused him and another guest to experience hours of vertigo and nausea. "Though I have little appetite for scandal," he wrote, "I must confess a concern. The flavor was acrid, and the texture of the greens unnatural. The children did not dine with us. Their absence was never explained." The letter was filed, then shelved. No investigation followed. In a separate corner of Norfolk, at St. Augustine's School for Orphaned Girls, a girl named Beatrice Ellis was admitted in June of 1802. She was 7. According to her intake record, she had been rescued from a failed placement with a family on Plum Street. Though the name Blackthorn is not listed, the address matches. Beatrice was mute upon arrival and remained so for 5 months. Her first documented drawing, preserved in the school's annual report, shows a table with 6 chairs, 1 knocked over, and a bowl at the center. Inside the bowl are small black dots. The matron, Sister Clara Winfield, described Beatrice as gentle, withdrawn, and fixated on ritual. She noted that the girl would not eat food unless she saw it prepared, and often asked in writing if milk was safe. Beatrice remained at the school until 1812. She never spoke of her time on Plum Street. By 1803, 5 Blackthorn children were buried, each under a headstone carved from the same quarry slate, with verses attributed to Mercy Blackthorn's own hand. None bore birth dates. Only names and short phrases like "taken for mercy" and "cleansed in sleep." The stonemason who carved the headstones, Jonathan Pennick, kept meticulous journals. In his entry for September 1803, he noted, "3rd stone this year for the Blackthorn plot. She asks for no cherubs, only words, and always in her own script, refuses to let me measure the grave. By this time, even city officials had begun to shift uneasily. A clerk named Addison Braith wrote in a private letter to his cousin in Richmond, "I had to witness the registration of another Blackthorn child this week. The mother wore a veil. The father said nothing. I smelled almonds." Você disse now continue with Chapter 1, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, beginning of the escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly, Chapter 1, Part 2 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles Longa Horror Dice. By the winter of 1803, the Blackthorn household had grown quieter still. Only one child remained, Margaret, the eldest, then nearly 16. Neighbours saw her less frequently, though when she did appear, escorted tightly by her mother, she seemed diminished. Her hair, once thick and ruddy, hung limp against her shoulders. Her cheeks were hollow, and her eyes moved slowly, as if trained to avoid contact. On the afternoon of December 11th, a laundress named Sella Grange delivered pressed linens to the Blackthorn home, as she had done every second Thursday for 4 years. In a written statement, archived at the Norfolk clerk's office, she described a sour chemical odor in the entrance hall and an odd moisture on the banister as she ascended the steps to deliver the package. It was cold outside, sharp wind, she wrote, but the house was hot as if stoked for baking. Yet there was no scent of bread or meat, only vinegar, bitter roots, and something else like burnt wool. Grange caught a glimpse of Margaret in the upstairs corridor. She was seated on a low stool, hands folded tightly in her lap, as if waiting to be spoken to. A fire blazed beside her, but she was wrapped in 2 shawls. She looked up at me once. Just once. Her lips moved, but there was no sound. Later that week, a mid-level official at the Bureau of Sanitation, Ira Weathers, logged an informal complaint regarding waste runoff behind the Plum Street properties. His report mentions the Blackthorn address by name, citing unusual residue near the root cellar drains, chalky white deposits, charred paper, and a foul-smelling brine that pooled under the stone boundary. Weathers requested permission to inspect the cellar, but was denied entry by Elias Blackthorn himself, who cited private family infirmity. The matter was dropped. By 1804, Mercy Blackthorn had ceased appearing in public altogether. She sent notes to merchants with specific lists and exact coin purses, tied shut with embroidery thread. No substitutions were accepted. The housemaid, May Cotter, had vanished. Some claimed she returned to her family near Roanoke. Others whispered she had been sent away after interfering with a medicine regimen. No official record of her departure exists. It was in that spring that Dr. Silas Trenholm re-emerged. After his troubling dinner experience 2 years prior, he had taken an interest in the increasing pattern of child deaths across Norfolk's elite families, though none so sharply clustered as the Blackthorns. He compiled a private ledger comparing known pediatric fatalities with local purchases of tonics, arsenicals, and emetics. When Mercy's name appeared 12 times over a period of 20 months, more than any other household in the county, he submitted a sealed letter to the Norfolk magistracy requesting permission for a coroner's inquest. The letter was acknowledged, but never answered. In April 1804, Margaret Blackthorn was seen wandering alone along Granby Street near the coastal embankment. She was barefoot, wearing a nightgown under her cloak, her eyes red-rimmed. An apprentice glazier named Bernard Creel helped her cross the street. He later gave testimony that she murmured something about roots that burn the tongue and broth that stings. She was returned home by 2 constables within the hour. No charges were filed. The official logbook listed the incident as episode of juvenile confusion due to nerves. Weeks later, the home's shutters were closed permanently. It was the Blackthorns' former groundskeeper, Leander Wicks, who would later provide the most damning early account. Dismissed in mid-1805 under vague pretenses, Wicks gave testimony to a traveling notary months later in exchange for passage to Ohio. His statement, while not entered into public record until 1810, offered new clarity. He described the back gardens as overgrown by design, deliberately let wild to cover a series of pits dug by Elias himself. Said it was for compost, but nothing grew there. No insects, no birds ever landed. Wicks also claimed to have observed Margaret being led at dusk into the root cellar with a flask and a basin. She was not seen again for 3 weeks. During this time, a visiting clerk from the Federal Customs Office, Norris Teal, lodged at a boarding house across from the Blackthorn residence. He kept a diary, later donated to the Norfolk Historical Society. In his entry for July 17, 1805, he wrote, "Saw the eldest girl today. Margaret, I think. She was at the upstairs window. I waved, but she made no motion, only pressed her hand to the glass. It left no print." 3 days later, a notice appeared in the record hall. Margaret Blackthorn departed July 20th. Natural affliction. The final child. Yet there was no service, no bell toll. The family pew at the chapel was left empty. With all 6 children buried, Elias and Mercy withdrew further, their movements erratic. Elias continued to file taxes and manage contracts through a proxy, a man named Reese Bellamy, whose association with the family would later come under scrutiny. Bellamy was neither kin nor formal employee. In interviews years later, townspeople described him as the one who handled their errands and the man in the grey coat who never looked up. Mercy's public silence became absolute. A dressmaker, Tilly Ganford, reported being summoned in October 1805 to deliver mourning gloves. She noted Mercy's complexion had altered dramatically. She was pale in a waxen way, not from grief, but as if something were drained. Her breath smelled of burnt lemon and iron. In that same month, the city received an unsigned envelope containing 6 hand-inked death certificates, all for the Blackthorn children. Each was unsealed. Each bore slight irregularities in the ink, like they had been recopied multiple times. On all 6, the attending physician was listed as MT, a designation that matched no licensed medical personnel in the Norfolk registry. A month later, Mercy Blackthorn's signature appeared in the burial fee ledger for a 7th and final time. The recipient listed unnamed infant, no date of birth, no recorded pregnancy. By the turn of 1806, Elias Blackthorn filed for a structural addition to the rear of their home, a stone-lined pantry with a locking gate. When city inspectors arrived in February to survey the planned expansion, they were met by Reese Bellamy. He denied them entry, claiming the family was unwell with fever. The request was approved without inspection. It would take another 3 years before a judge ordered any part of the Blackthorn home to be entered by force. But by then the parlor had been stripped of furniture. The hearth was cold. The windows were sealed shut with wax, and no one, servant, child, or visitor, had been seen crossing the threshold for over a year. Vosegisi now continue with Chapter 2, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script escalation, where you will show how events become more disturbing and impossible to ignore. Introduce external figures, investigators, journalists, authorities, religious figures, and their first impressions. Add contradictions, disappearance of evidence, and conflicting accounts. Increase the tension with every sentence, preparing the viewer for the climax. This part must contain between 100 and 2,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify, do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi. Taisu lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 2, Part 1 completed, absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3. Roterista. Inglis Longa Horror. Dice, the first person to cross the Blackthorn threshold under official order was Reverend Henry Gall, a circuit preacher known for his temperance sermons and distaste for political entanglements. In early May 1806, after repeated requests from the Norfolk Presbytery to verify the family's welfare, Gall arrived at Plum Street with a sealed letter of ecclesiastical mandate and a copy of the burial register. What he expected, by his own account, was a house subdued by grief. What he encountered was silence so deep it magnified the sounds of his own movement. Boots against the stone steps, the creak of the iron latch, the dry rasp of his breath inside his collar. When the door opened, it was Elias who stood there. Thin, still wearing his formal waistcoat despite the heat, he blinked once before stepping aside without speaking. Gall later wrote that the man's skin looked powdered, not with flour, but with the pallor of long airlessness. Inside, the home smelled faintly of pickling brine and candle soot. The walls were darker than Gall remembered, not from paint, but from grime that had not been washed down in years. There were no signs of children. No toys, no portraits, no voices from the upper rooms. Mercy was not seen at all. Gall conducted a brief interview in the sitting room, during which Elias offered him a cordial of spiced brandy and stated in clipped syllables that all matters of health and spirit have been attended. When pressed to verify the identities and deaths of the 6 children, Elias grew evasive. "What's buried stays buried, Reverend," he said, "and what is remembered need not be disturbed." The visit lasted 12 minutes. Gall left unsettled, and the following week he submitted a confidential letter to the diocesan clerk in Williamsburg. "The house is wrong, not by doctrine, but by weight. Something heavy in that place, as if the air holds a memory it should not." The letter was never forwarded to Norfolk's civil offices. It remains filed in the church archives, unread by magistrates. Meanwhile, city officials began receiving uncoordinated but mounting complaints. A midwife named Dinah Merton reported that 3 of her former apprentices had been turned away from the Blackthorn home after responding to anonymous labor requests. All 3 women described a man matching Reese Bellamy's appearance, waiting near the back gate, offering silver in advance, but warning they would not be permitted to speak, even if addressed. None returned after their first visit. Another complaint came from Albert Finch, a young constable tasked with property census updates. On August 2, 1806, Finch attempted to confirm the residential status of Mercy Blackthorn. His knock was answered not by a person, but by the sudden sound of glass shattering behind the parlor curtain. When he called out, there was no reply. He reported the incident to his supervisor, but no follow-up was scheduled. 2 days later, Finch was transferred to the Granary Patrol without explanation. It was not until September that a more structured investigation began to form. Dr. Silas Trenholm, increasingly alarmed by the lack of action, compiled a formal dossier of deaths, merchant receipts, servant depositions, and pharmacy ledgers. He submitted it directly to Magistrate Abram Laurel, a man known for his rigid record-keeping and loyalty to the mercantile elite. Laurel dismissed the dossier after 36 hours, citing insufficient cause for intrusion upon respectable citizens. Days later, 2 entries from the dossier disappeared from the public archives. They concerned the 1801 arsenic purchase and the burial invoice for unnamed infant. Trenholm, undeterred, approached an old associate editor, Milton Darrow of the Norfolk Weekly Herald. Darrow was skeptical, but agreed to assign one of his staff reporters, Clara Ames, to examine the situation discreetly. Ames, the daughter of a cobbler, had a reputation for unearthing contradictions in tax filings and trade manifests. On October 9, 1806, she walked the length of Plum Street, pausing twice across from the Blackthorn residence. Her first entry in her field notebook noted, "All curtains drawn, chimney cold, second floor sill marked by crusted liquid runoff, smells faintly like pickled eggs and mildew." Ames spent the next 10 days cross-referencing burial plots, census records, and religious registers. Her findings were troubling. No birth certificates had ever been filed for 4 of the 6 children. The chapel's copy of the death notices was missing, replaced by a gap in the ledger. and a page torn from its binding. When she visited St. Augustine's orphan school to inquire about Beatrice Ellis, she was told the girl had been relocated. No forwarding record was provided. The matron who had once described Beatrice's behaviors, Sister Clara Winfield, had died the previous month of unspecified illness. Her personal effects were claimed within 2 days by an unknown man, signing only as RB. As Amy's prepared her draft, a fire broke out in the basement of the Herald's print shop. It was quickly extinguished, but the corner of her locked desk was scorched. Her notes were unharmed, though pages had been reordered. When she attempted to speak with Magistrate Laurel again, she was told he was no longer taking meetings and had taken temporary leave for digestive disturbances. He would not return to public life. With her story now stalled, Amy's delivered a sworn affidavit to the county archivist, demanding her research be sealed but preserved. That document was reopened 8 years later, during an unrelated investigation. It included a sketch of a stone tablet bearing only initials and the cryptic phrase, "What was taken was first invited." At the same time, a new figure entered the inquiry. Archivist and public notary Miles Dorr, contracted by the state to perform an audit of medical practitioner licenses. Dorr found the name MT used across several Norfolk death certificates, including the 6 Blackthorn children, but never attached to any registered doctor, coroner, or midwife in the state. His audit trail led to a burned-out storage annex near the harbor, where several crates of municipal records had been stored. The crate containing Mercy Blackthorn's pharmaceutical permits had been smashed and partially emptied. The index sheet naming its contents was missing. When Dorr sought to verify Mercy's suppliers, he visited the apothecary listed on her last known receipt, Westerly and Sons. The establishment had shuttered in June 1806 after a sudden bankruptcy. The eldest son, Harold Westerly, had vanished, leaving behind a shop full of unsold tinctures and unpaid debts. The property had been stripped of all ledgers. Dorr's notes, kept in a brown folio now housed at the Virginia Historical Vault, include one line written in haste, "Spoke to Elias or Bellamy?" Tone detached, said, "What's made cannot be unmade." And who would want to? No further contact with the Blackthorn family was recorded that year. As the temperature dropped into November, neighbors began noting an acrid haze that sometimes lifted from the rear chimney. It burned at the throat, yet left no lasting scent. On 2 occasions, livestock tethered nearby refused to pass the gate, balking and pulling away until led elsewhere. Children dared each other to touch the brass knocker, but none did more than lay a single finger on its lion's head. Despite the visible signs, no search warrant was issued. It would take the disappearance of a man to change that. Verset d'ici. Now continue with Chapter 2, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script Escalation. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters. Aitukara masantunma. Tiety lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 2, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista. Inglis Longa Horror Disse. The man who vanished was Rhys Bellamy. On December 3, 1806, the Norfolk Civil Records Office noted Bellamy's absence after he failed to appear for a sworn deposition regarding shipment discrepancies involving Elias Blackthorn's warehouse accounts. His name had surfaced during a broader audit of missing inventory linked to refined sugar shipments and improperly declared quantities of medicinal spirits. Bellamy, who had functioned as the Blackthorn family's unofficial representative for years, had never held formal licensure. Still, he signed more than a dozen contracts on Elias's behalf. That alone raised scrutiny. 2 city clerks were dispatched to locate him, beginning with a call at the Blackthorn residence. They reported finding the front gate chained from the inside, with a padlock not used elsewhere in the district. When they knocked, there was movement behind the parlor curtain. Once, then stillness. Neither Elias nor Mercy responded. The men left a summons tucked into the hinge. The following day, an envelope was discovered on the records office steps. Inside was Bellamy's signature, scrawled once in red ink across a sheet of unlined parchment. Below it, a short message. He is not lost, he has returned. There was no date, no location, no context. The ink was analyzed and found to contain iron oxide and tinctured dye, ingredients not used in standard office pens. Within a week, news of Bellamy's disappearance spread. Traders refused to accept Blackthorn contracts. Carters bypassed their warehouse. The local bank froze Elias's accounts after failing to confirm his identity in person, yet still, no one had stepped inside the house. The turning point came on December 18th, when the Reverend Henry Gall, increasingly distressed by his earlier visit, and now convinced something irreversible was unfolding, returned to Plum Street. This time he brought with him another clergyman, Father Albin Farrow, a visiting Jesuit from the Maryland Mission, known for his detailed observations and dispassionate demeanor. Farrow's journal provides the most complete account of the second and final entry into the Blackthorn home before the warrant. At 2:47 p.m., Gall and Farrow arrived and found the gate unchained. The front door was ajar. The air that met them was thick with warmth, despite the cold wind outside, and smelled faintly of beeswax, vinegar, and something chemical they could not identify. Inside, the hallway was darker than expected. Every curtain had been nailed shut from within, and strips of fabric hung over interior thresholds. A glass jar filled with cloudy liquid sat on the hall table beside an extinguished candle and a child's silver comb. Farrow noted that the floorboards creaked unevenly, as though loosened or warped by moisture. Gall called out twice, once by name, once by blessing. There was no reply. In the dining room, the table was set for 3. One chair had been knocked over. The plates were dry but dusty, as if they had not been used for weeks. A thin film of oil clung to the rim of one goblet. They moved upstairs. In the first bedroom, likely Margaret's, the mattress was bare and sunken in the middle. On the dresser lay a folded child's chemise, neatly laundered and scented with lemon balm. Farrow described the sensation of being watched, but not from within the room. It was as if the air itself held the memory of someone recently breathing here, like a pressure behind the walls, not from presence but from absence too long held in. In the master bedroom, Mercy was found sitting in a high-backed chair, her face turned toward the closed window. She did not startle. She did not speak. A length of white cloth was wrapped around her left hand, stained through with a brownish crust. She held a folded letter in her lap. Elias was not present. Farrow approached cautiously and offered her his hand. She looked at him, then lowered her gaze. The letter was not addressed. On it, only a short phrase in faint script. No remedy, only silence. Gall reached for her other hand and found her fingers cold. She offered no resistance, but began to tremble when they attempted to help her stand. Instead, she sank deeper into the chair, her breath shallow, her eyes vacant. They left without forcing her to move. Gall returned the next morning with an order of guardianship, but the house was locked again and no one answered. The letter she held disappeared. It was not among the items logged later that month when city officials finally entered the house. Under warrant. That warrant was signed on December 23rd, authorized jointly by Acting Magistrate Ernest Caldwell and Interim Physician in Charge Dr. Thomas Vier. It granted entry, search, and seizure of documents and samples tied to the unexplained deaths and Bellamy's disappearance. The entry team consisted of Vier, 2 constables, and Miles Dorr, whose records had laid the groundwork for the operation. They arrived at dawn. Snow had fallen overnight, but there were no footprints around the gate. The interior smelled of spoiled fruit and lime powder. Mercy was no longer seated in the bedroom. The chair was gone. In the kitchen, the hearth was cold but stacked with recently charred logs. An open tin of preserved prunes sat on the counter beside a small vial of chalky residue. In the cellar, Vier made the most troubling discovery. A locked cabinet beneath the stairs behind a wall panel. The cabinet contained 6 glass jars sealed with wax and wrapped in linen. Each jar held small items: baby teeth, lengths of hair tied with thread, pieces of cloth stained in various hues. All were labelled with initials: EB, RB, MB, TB, ZB, and MGB. Adjacent to the jars were 4 ledgers. Most of the pages were either blank or so faded as to be illegible, but interspersed between the entries were recipes, not culinary, but medicinal, treatments for digestive ailments, insomnia, nervous exhaustion. Many included dosages inconsistent with known safe use. One such page detailed a mixture of laudanum, crushed cherry pits, and lead filings. At the bottom, in a childlike scrawl, "For quiet nights." The constables reported that the parlour walls had been scratched in places, thin vertical marks, as if made by fingernails or a metal pick. These scratches stopped abruptly 3 inches from the floor and resumed on the opposite wall. They found no signs of Elias, no signs of Bellamy. The servant quarters had been stripped. Mercy was eventually located in a second-floor dressing closet, standing upright, eyes open, unresponsive. A physician declared her in a catatonic state. She was transported to St. Lazarus House for observation, a private facility north of Norfolk. She never spoke again. Her belongings, including the chair and the letter, were not recovered. News of the investigation reached Richmond within the week. A courier from the State Oversight Committee arrived to examine the findings. The jars were sealed, catalogued, and moved to an evidence vault. 2 would later disappear. The report issued to the public was cautious, citing chemical mismanagement, possible misdiagnosis, and prolonged exposure to unsafe medicinal substances. It avoided the word poison entirely. But among those who had seen the cellar, who had read the margins of those ledgers, there was no doubt that the deaths were not accidents, and yet no charges were filed. Voce Dis now continue with Chapter 3, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script confrontation or discovery. Report the most intense and revealing moment, discovery of bodies, files, forbidden objects, hidden rooms, etc. Describe every visual and auditory detail realistically, avoiding gratuitous gore but not concealing the gravity. Show the reactions of witnesses and authorities in the face of the revealed horror. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, dudinmat lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary. Summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 3, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista, Ingles Longa Horror, Dice. It was not until March 1807, 3 months after the legal entry into the Blackthorn residence, that the cellar yielded its final contents. The second inspection was ordered, after an anonymous tip reached the Norfolk Record Office, in the form of a folded scrap of parchment slipped beneath the side door. On it, a map of the Blackthorn property had been drawn in delicate graphite, annotated with notations. Beneath, true floor, ledger wall. There was no signature, no date, only a series of small square symbols along the cellar's perimeter. The drawing matched no official blueprints of the house. This time the team that returned to Plum Street was larger. Dr. Thomas Vire was joined by Miles Dorr, a newly appointed coroner named Francis Melling, and 3 uniformed constables, 1 carrying a mason's hammer and 2 lengths of chain. They arrived in the grey stillness of dawn. The sky was unbroken, a flat slab of ash-coloured light. Snow clung to the roof tiles and curled in frost patterns across the parlour windows. The cellar entrance groaned as it opened, hinges swollen with damp. The air that emerged was heavy with lime and something more acidic, rotted citrus perhaps, or the residual trace of tannic bark. The stairs descended into thick shadow, the stone uneven underfoot, dry in patches, slick in others, The smell worsened the deeper they went. Melling coughed into his kerchief, gagged once, and continued. They began on the west wall, where the drawing had marked a segment labelled Ledger Wall. Behind a sagging bookcase they found a set of narrow shelves built directly into the foundation. The ledgers inside were brittle, their bindings frayed and stained with what appeared to be ink and mould. But one book, smaller than the rest, wrapped in oiled cloth, bore no title. When Dor unwrapped it, a curl of reddish dust escaped the binding. The pages inside were not records but a kind of journal. Entries appeared sporadic and fragmented, written in different hands. One section read, "Zek coughs after the bitter one. Says his eyes burn. Mercy says it's the roots adjusting." Another, in a more jagged script, "Thomas cries when the bottle is full. We must not let him cry." On the inside cover, faint and nearly erased, a single sentence, "This is not punishment. This is correction." As Vier examined the adjacent stonework, he noticed a faint seam running horizontally along the floor. It was not mortar, but something more recent, filled with tamped clay and ash. The team cleared the area and began to dig. The top layer gave way easily. Beneath it, a wooden panel with rusted hinges. It was not locked. When they pried it open, a rush of stale, metallic air filled the room. The space below was no more than 4 feet deep. Inside, lined against the cold stone, were 6 small caskets. Each was identical in construction. Pine, roughly planed, no engravings, no handles, no padding. They were placed with eerie precision, end to end, lid to lid, as if arranged for observation rather than burial. The first casket creaked when opened. Inside lay the remains of a child, no older than 6. The bones were largely intact, positioned in a curled shape, arms folded across the chest. A fragment of lace still clung to the collarbone, browned and brittle. There were no signs of violent trauma, no fractures or breaks. But the jawbone bore faint dark staining, and the interior of the casket had a crusted residue along the seams, signs consistent with prolonged emetic expulsion before death. Each of the 6 caskets held similar remains. None bore identifying items save for small tokens, a carved wooden button, a threadbare ribbon, a tiny silver thimble. The last casket, smallest of all, held not bones, but a soft bundle of cloth wrapped around what appeared to be a dried umbilical, cord and a scrap of paper marked with the initials MT. The room had gone silent. Melling stood back against the far wall, his face blanched, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. Dor steadied himself against the stair rail, mouth clamped shut. No one spoke for nearly 5 minutes. Only Vier knelt, pen in hand, sketching the arrangement with precise, deliberate strokes. They resealed the pit, but left the panel exposed. The remains were to be transferred to the municipal crypt, but delays in legal processing would leave them in situ for 3 more weeks. During that time, the house was placed under round-the-clock guard. 3 men rotated shifts. By the 2nd week, 2 refused to return. One reported hearing a woman speaking in low tones from the parlor, though no one had entered. The other claimed the smell of almonds and vinegar became so thick near the cellar door he could not breathe. The journal was sent for transcription. As the pages were copied, the inconsistencies in handwriting became more pronounced. The earlier entries, dated 1796 to 1798, were written in the structured hand of Elias Blackthorn. The middle entries, short, emotionally clipped, matched samples known to be Mercy's. But the final 6 entries, unsigned and without dates, were erratic, almost childlike in their rhythm. They cried too much. I tried the syrup, less bitter. The sleeping ones are quieter. I made them clean. She said it would stop if I learned. I learned. When Mercy was shown the journal at St. Lazarus under controlled observation, she did not respond. But when the page with the phrase "I learned" was turned toward her, she made a single sound, low, barely audible, between a sigh and a gasp. Her eyes remained unfocused. She did not speak again. A second chamber was found the following week, concealed behind a shelf of pickling jars near the pantry. This room was smaller and dry. It contained a table, a porcelain basin, and several tin containers. The containers were labeled with botanical names: Atropa belladonna, Prunus dulcis, Papaver somniferum. A mortar and pestle sat beside an open book detailing dosage for adult males, adult females, and youth of restlessness. There were scrawled calculations in the margins, ratios and notes. Twice daily too strong. Reduce bark. Increase almond. Observe iris color. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet, authorities found a folded cloth bundle containing curls of hair tied with silk thread and a spoon blackened at the tip. The cumulative evidence, though damning, created no single irrefutable narrative. There was no admission of intent, no direct proof of who administered the substances. But there was no longer doubt among the officials present. These were not accidents. These were not illnesses. The 6 children had been silenced by care disguised as cure. Reverend Gall, shown the findings, wept openly. He had baptized 3 of the children. He had once shared brandy with Elias. Vere recommended that the house be vacated and sealed. The recommendation was denied. Officials demanded further inquiry. But behind the scenes, panic had begun to take root. Elias Blackthorn's whereabouts were still unknown. His warehouse was abandoned. His former business partner, Howard Hessel, had left Norfolk the month prior without collecting several owed payments. And the only remaining trace of Rhys Bellamy, beside his signature on the red parchment, was a grey wool coat found draped over the back fence, soaked through and stiff with frost. The city filed a motion to designate the Blackthorn residence a site of legal investigation and forensic examination. Approval was delayed by administrative backlog and jurisdictional disagreement with the Richmond office. For now, the house remained standing, unsealed, watched, and remembered. Vosedis now continue with Chapter 3, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Confrontation or Discovery. This part must contain between 1,100 and 500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters, do not lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly. Chapter 3, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Rotirista, Inglis longa hora dice. The final confrontation with the Blackthorn case came not with a confession, but through the unintentional exposure of their most guarded architectural secret. It occurred on April 4, 1807, when city-appointed surveyor Nathaniel Stokes arrived with a draftsman to chart the structure for state documentation. The city had received a petition to demolish unused properties on Plum Street for public safety. Though the Blackthorn home had not yet been condemned, it was added to the preliminary review list due to multiple reports of hazardous fumes and structural decay. Stokes, a man with a long history in foundation work, noticed an anomaly immediately. The proportions of the interior rooms did not match the recorded outer measurements. From the garden-facing wall to the street-facing facade, there was a difference of nearly 7 feet, unaccounted for, even when accounting for chimney bulk and bricked hallways. The rear of the house, it seemed, was deeper than it appeared. He returned the following day with permission to dismantle part of the inner pantry wall. The constables present recorded the operation in detail. Behind the brick, sealed with a thick layer of plaster and straw, they uncovered a narrow corridor, descending on a steep angle without railing. The air that issued forth was dense and cold, touched with the bitterness of iron and wet stone. No known plans included this passage. The corridor ended in a small domed chamber, constructed of overlapping brick layers blackened with soot. In the center, a wrought iron table was bolted to the floor, no more than 3 feet high. On it, a box, lead-lined, locked with a brass clasp, was found. Stokes did not open it. Instead, he summoned the magistrate's clerk, who delivered the box under escort to the records office. Inside were hundreds of folded pages, stained, torn, some burned at the corners. They were not bound, but sorted into loose bundles tied with ribbon. Each bundle was labeled with a name. The names matched the children. These were not medical notes nor household lists. They were letters, unsent, often unfinished, written from parent to child, from Mercy and Elias both. Some were short. "Forgive me. The world is not for you." Your cough grows louder. "I've tried so much. I watched you sleep. You looked clean." Others rambled, desperate, scattered across the pages in loops and corrections. "I told the pastor you were improving. I lied, I had to. They cannot know how you look at me now. How your hands twitch even in rest. They say it's fever, but it's not fever, it's noise, it's always the noise. I can't keep asking you to swallow what burns, but if you don't, you will wake again with blood in your mouth. I saw your gums bleeding yesterday. I wiped it away before May could see." The language deteriorated further in the letters attributed to the later years. Ruth tried to leave the bed. She asked for Ezekiel. She doesn't understand. None of them do. They don't remember what happened the first time. "I held Thomas until he stopped shaking. I held him too long. I smelled almonds in his breath. I must change the measurement." Of all the bundles, one was marked not with a name, but with a symbol, a ring drawn in ink, closed with a single stroke. Inside were writings that bore a different tone, ritualistic, obsessive. They recorded days of silence, hours of watching the fire, notations about the position of the moon and the behavior of milk when boiled. These writings were unsigned, but repeated a phrase throughout. "Correction is not cruelty. Correction is peace." Outside the sealed room, other inspectors turned attention to the backyard. A team of gravediggers, led by former coroner's assistant Thaddeus Lear, began probing the overgrown plot behind the home. The soil, thick with clay and laced with broken glass, was resistant to shovels, but by late afternoon they uncovered the first of what would be 9 shallow graves. Unlike the crypt below the house, these held no caskets. The bodies had long since decayed into partial remains, scattered and compressed. Only fragments remained, a jawbone here, a spine curled into a tight spiral. None had been officially recorded in any burial ledger. Forensic reconstruction suggested at least 4 of the remains were children. 2 were adult-sized, and 3 were indeterminate due to degradation. Among the remains, 3 objects were retrieved intact. A brass ring engraved with the initials RB, a pearl-buttoned cufflink traced back to Elias's earliest trade manifest, and a burned comb identical to the one seen weeks earlier on the hall table. This find pushed authorities to reconsider the full scale of the case. A second inquiry was launched to determine whether the Blackthorn children were the only victims. If so, who were the others? Servants? Orphans? Unregistered births? Several years of the Norfolk birth index had been lost in the 1800 courthouse fire, leaving gaps that no one could now fill. As the evidence mounted, the public grew increasingly restless. Rumors flooded the town that Mercy had spoken in tongues at the asylum, that Elias had fled aboard a sugar vessel to Barbados, that the children had never existed at all. The house became an object of spectacle, drawing townspeople who stood behind barricades hoping to glimpse the interior. Some claimed to hear crying at night, others the scrape of metal. Nothing was ever confirmed. On April 19th, St. Lazarus House filed an official statement declaring Mercy Blackthorn medically unfit to stand trial. The statement described her condition as irreversible dissociative silence. She no longer blinked on command. Her hands remained curled at her lap, unmoving, save for one occasion when she lifted her index finger and traced a circle onto the arm of her chair, slow, exact, unbroken. She was transferred to a private wing. No visitors were permitted. The town of Norfolk filed a motion to demolish the Blackthorn home. The request was tabled. Instead, the house remained, roped off and watched, its upper windows dark and thick with soot. The curtains never moved. Inside, the cellar walls grew damp again as the spring thaw began, and the wood of the false floor began to bow. Vier returned once, weeks later, alone, to collect a remaining vial for examination. When he emerged, he was pale and trembling. He refused to explain why. Later that year, Miles Dorr resigned his post and left Norfolk entirely. His last written note, addressed to an unknown recipient, read only, "They were not monsters, but what they did to make things quiet." The sentence was never finished. Você diz now continue with Chapter 4, Part 1. This chapter represents in the script consequences and legacy. Report the outcome. Arrests, closures, trials, political or social changes. Show how the community and collective memory dealt with the case in the following years. Conclude with an enigmatic and unsettling final sentence that leaves a lingering doubt in the viewer's mind. This part must contain between 100 and 1,500 words. Continue the chapter without repeating, summarizing, or recapping previous content. Maintain the same style, tone, and pacing. This structure is mandatory, no exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify, do not use full capital words, do not use forbidden characters, ditiudi. Suicibon lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of this part or chapter, do not write any additional commentary, summary, prompt, or instruction. Write only and exactly Chapter 4, Part 1 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roteirista Ingles Longa Horror. Dice, the legal proceedings began in the summer of 1807, months after the final discoveries at the Blackthorn residence, but there was no trial in the conventional sense. With Mercy Blackthorn declared unfit for interrogation and Elias Blackthorn still unaccounted for, the court proceedings unfolded more as a public inventory than a judicial reckoning. The Norfolk magistrate convened a formal inquiry on June 2nd, intended not to establish guilt, but to determine civic responsibility and procedural failure. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Merchants, clergy, educators, and neighbors filled the gallery, their eyes fixed on the exhibits laid out on linen-covered tables. The jars from the cellar, the scorched journal pages, the recovered letters, all labeled and arranged beneath glass. People did not speak. They stared. Dr. Thomas Veer delivered his testimony first, reading from his notes in a voice that barely lifted above the shuffling of shoes. He described the pit beneath the false floor, the absence of any embalming, the toxicity levels found in the bones of the children. The term he used, cumulative correctional exposure, would later appear in regional medical journals as a chilling euphemism for poison administered as care. Francis Melling, visibly shaken, refused to take the stand. His written affidavit was read aloud by the clerk. What I saw cannot be reconstructed in language without doing violence to sense. No one else involved in the original investigation contested the evidence. But still, without a living, responsive perpetrator, the law hesitated. On July 14th, the court formally seized the Blackthorn estate. Assets were liquidated, properties sold, and the warehouse holdings redistributed under state supervision. All proceeds, by order of governor's decree, were directed toward the newly established Norfolk Orphan and Convalescent Relief Fund. The public, for a time, approved, but the deeper questions were not addressed. No formal charges were filed. Mercy Blackthorn remained confined at St. Lazarus, visited monthly by a nurse, and once, discreetly, by Reverend Gall. He did not speak of what occurred during the visit, but he resigned his post at the church 2 weeks later and relocated to a coastal parish in Maine. Elias Blackthorn's name lingered in trade manifests for several months, cited as a former guarantor of bonds, now defunct. Inquiries were made to shipping outposts in Savannah and New York. One captain recalled a man matching Elias's description boarding under a false name in early 1806, bound for Veracruz. No confirmation ever surfaced. Eventually, the search was dropped. Of the bodies found in the yard, 3 were interred without identification. The 2 adult skeletons, tentatively labeled Unknown Female A and Unknown Male B, were given unmarked headstones in a municipal plot west of town. The others, child-sized, were buried near the original 6, this time with plain markers and numerical designations. A plaque was later added at the request of townspeople. Here rest those whom no one claimed, but whom none could ignore. In the following years, Norfolk changed. The house on Plum Street remained standing until 1811. During that time, it was placed under state control and designated closed to entry pending final disposition. Children dared each other to touch the steps. Vagrants who approached were turned away. A fire broke out in the rear chamber in October 1809, suspected arson, but it failed to spread beyond the pantry. After the fire, 2 constables tasked with security refused to return. They filed handwritten resignations, citing an unnatural stillness and the recurring smell of iron and vinegar that no storm could wash away. Local legislators debated whether the structure should be repurposed as a school or medical dispensary. The motion failed. It was not demolished. It simply decayed, brick by brick, until the roof collapsed during a coastal gale in 1811. The lot was cleared without ceremony. The earth beneath it was salted and fenced. Nothing has been built there since. The Norfolk Weekly Herald published a 3-part series in late 1807 titled The House with No Crying. Written by Clara Ames under a pseudonym, the articles recounted the findings without naming names, referring only to a family of considerable propriety. The editor later received an unsigned letter threatening libel action. Nothing came of it. But Ames never wrote for the Herald again. She moved to Philadelphia and took work with a census bureau. In her effects, donated after her death, was a torn page from the Blackthorn journal. On it, faint ink read, "Correction never ends." For many in Norfolk, the case became something not discussed directly but embedded in behavior. Families began to request physician signatures on all death certificates. Apothecaries were required to log all purchases of belladonna and bitter almond by address, not just surname. Children were no longer expected to sit in perfect silence at meals, nor were they left alone when ill, even for a moment. In 1808, the Norfolk School Board removed a textbook from its curriculum that included a passage on obedience equating silence with virtue. It was replaced with a text emphasizing the value of questioning. Those who had once respected the Blackthorns, their dinner guests, their business partners, their neighbors who had nodded politely from pews, rarely admitted the closeness of the connection. Instead, they spoke in the passive voice. The house fell. The children faded. The quiet grew too loud. Yet records remained. In 1810, the state archivist assigned to review all correspondence between the Norfolk magistracy and the governor's office discovered a letter misfiled in a medical register. It bore no author, but referenced the initial refusal to open an inquest. "They are respected," it read. "They are practiced. They are not to be doubted. Mercy is a virtue, and silence is its price." Stamped faintly at the bottom was a seal used only by the Office of Inland Health. The archivist who found it, Jonas Hill, requested anonymity in the final report. He refused to testify and left the service 6 months later. Before departing, he entered a final note into the record. They believed they were healing the world inside their walls, and they left no instructions for what to do if they failed. But the ledger at St. Augustine still holds one last contradiction. In a locked drawer of the intake cabinet, there remains a folded letter dated April 1797. It was never sent. It is signed Margaret Blackthorn, and it is addressed to Dear Beatrice. It ends with 7 words. If you can speak, speak for me. Vos Dis now continue with Chapter 4, Part 2, the second half of the section of the script, Consequences and Legacy. This part must contain between 1,100 and 1,500 words. Continue this part without repeating the previous section, but maintaining continuity. Keep the same style, tone, and pacing. Attention. This is the final part of the script. This structure is mandatory. No exceptions. Before submitting the content, verify. Do not use full capital words. Do not use forbidden characters. Obscene lists. Style and continuity must be preserved. At the end of Chapter 4, Part 2, include this text exactly as written. Text. Write only and exactly. Chapter 4, Part 2 completed. Absolutely nothing else. Use this exact formatting and wait for instructions to proceed with the next chapter and part. Do absolutely nothing until further orders are given. C3 Roterista Ingles Longa Horror Dis. By the spring of 1811, the last physical remnants of the Blackthorn family's presence in Norfolk had all but vanished. Their name, once tied to trade ledgers, warehouse titles, and charitable dinners, had been carefully removed from business records. Storefronts that once carried Elias Blackthorn's seal had replaced their signage. Even the apothecaries, those that remained, scrubbed old purchase logs, crossing out entries under the pretense of outdated bookkeeping practices. Yet in private, their memory persisted. Whispers circulated through the portside taverns and drawing rooms of the city's more established homes. Children of former neighbors were told not to walk past the lot on Plum Street. Newly hired nurses and midwives were quietly warned to question prescriptions that came without a doctor's name. The smell of almonds, once associated with fine confections, became a source of unease. In the year following the public inquiry, 4 more letters were found. Each was unsigned, but all were delivered in the same way, folded into a ledger, slipped between municipal files, tucked into the back pages of civic reports. Each one was a variation of a message first encountered months earlier. No remedy, only silence. Another read, "He knew the measurement." A third said only, "It continued." The last, discovered in the lining of a tax assessment envelope, was the most disturbing. There were more. None of the letters were traced. The paper stock did not match local mills. The handwriting differed just enough to prevent positive attribution. But each bore the same faint watermark, a ring drawn in ink, closed with a single stroke. Officials, weary of the case and its social tremors, ceased investigation. At St. Lazarus, Mercy Blackthorn remained under guarded care. In 1812, a nurse reported that she had begun to hum, a single note, low and monotone, repeated at irregular intervals. It was neither melody nor tune. She stopped after 12 days and did not make sound again. Her fingernails grew long and curved into her palms. She did not resist when they were trimmed. Her attending physician, Dr. Anselward, petitioned twice to transfer her to a less secure facility, claiming no signs of violence, only unending withdrawal. Both petitions were denied. Ward resigned the following year, and later published a small volume of essays titled "The Quiet Eye: Cases in Involuntary Silence." One chapter, left untitled, consists only of descriptions of a seated woman and the contents of a drawer locked behind her. As time moved on, the Blackthorn legacy split in two. The first, recorded in ledgers and quiet archives, remains the domain of public record. The children's deaths, the discovered remains, the closed inquiry. The second resides in oral recollection, half-remembered observations, erased documents, gaps in the census, items sold without buyer names, deaths signed by M.T. In 1813, Reverend Henry Gall died in his sleep. Among his papers, his nephew found a folded note wrapped in a ribbon. The handwriting did not match Gall's. The note read, "You baptized what should not have been named." That same year, the Norfolk School Board received a donation from an unnamed benefactor earmarked for the study of botanical toxicology. The donation came with a leather-bound volume of plant diagrams, including rare annotations on dosage, thresholds for children. The title page had no author. Inside the front cover, one sentence had been carefully etched with a stylus. "Use with care. Use with care." The book was shelved and later lost. By 1815, the lot on Plum Street had returned to wild growth. Weeds overtook the salted earth and vines crept through the remnants of the brick foundation. A contractor hired to remove the last stones claimed to hear a ticking beneath the soil, as if a clock buried itself long ago and had refused to stop. He did not return to the job. The Norfolk Board of Trustees quietly withdrew their intention to sell the land. For several years, nothing grew properly in the area. Fruit trees bore bitter yields. Flowers wilted prematurely. A single oak took root, but never expanded beyond a gnarled trunk and 2 twisted branches. It was eventually cut down, and the wood burned without aroma. In the broader county, mention of the Blackthorn family became a social misstep. Invitations bearing the name were declined. A boy born in 1816, given the surname Blackthorn by coincidence, had it legally changed before his 10th birthday. Even his school records were amended by hand. And yet, in certain corners of Norfolk, particularly among nurses, clerks, and those who handled records, a quiet code endured. When a file could not be accounted for, or when a name reappeared where it had once been erased, someone would whisper, "It's a Blackthorn mark." It meant nothing had vanished. It had only slipped out of sight. The final official entry associated with the case came in 1819, when the Virginia State Registrar conducted a retrospective audit of unaccounted burial permits. Among the flagged cases was an unnamed infant buried in 1803. The certificate was filed in a drawer marked "Resolved," but next to the child's name was a faint note in red: "Confirm ledger before reclassification." The ledger it referred to was missing. In its place, tucked into the fold of the drawer, was a single silver button. When held to the light, its surface showed scratches, etched in small, deliberate strokes. A circle, closed with a single mark. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way, we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.